thank you very much for having found the time to attend this webinar. This webinar is part of the process that will feed into the guidelines on closer to nature forestry, which according to the biodiversity strategy to 2030 and the EU forest strategy to 2030 will be adopted by the Commission soon this year, by the second quarter of 2022. We are conducting this work in very close cooperation with member states and stakeholders in the framework of the Working Group Forest and Nature, who has been invited in its entirety to this webinar. The discussion is very open and very lively. We have several positions have been made clear. We are discussing in particular on issues like the scope and the objectives of the guidelines. What is important is to now open this process to a moment where we listen to academia and we listen to practitioners to have your views on these topics. These guidelines, it's important for you to know, those who are not part of the group, are a voluntary tool. I underline voluntary tool to support the foresters to move closer to the close to nature forestry when they wish to do so. So the idea is those who want and have a forestry practice that benefits in particular biodiversity, they can choose to comply with these guidelines. They are, I repeat, not compulsory, and they are not something that has to include all the forestry practices that exist today. But we have to define what the closer to nature forestry means in order to distill out, let's say, the practices that we want to appear as particular, not something that has to repeat simply what happens in Europe today, which would be more sustainable forest management. This is part of sustainable forest management, and as I said, it is something that will be used only voluntary to those who want to strengthen biodiversity protection and climate change, and also have forest practice that can go hand in hand with long-term economic stability, as people will show. So we will have in the first section of this webinar 4 presentations, and this presentation will be of different perspective of what closer to nature forestry could entail in general, with a specific reference to different bioregions, and then to traditional practices and what the results combining these differences are or are expected to be. So we are very happy to have this variety of presentations. Let me underline that after each presentation, you will have the possibility to ask technical clarifications via the chat, whereas we will have a discussion on the main messages at the end of the first session. So after each presentation, you can put requests for technical clarifications in the chat, but we will have then at the end of the four presentation, we will have a discussion. Finally, let me just remind that we are recording this webinar for internal purposes. So it's not going to be published, but it will be put into the intranet, the Circa system, which the Forest and Nature can access to. So for those who want to listen to this afterwards, but it will not be published. So it's important that you know that we are recording. So if I haven't forgotten anything important, without taking further time, I would pass the floor to the first presenter, who's Professor Jørgen Bo Larsen. Members of the working group know him because he's been working with us as well. And Bo, the floor is yours for the first presentation. You have, I think, until 10:35, so you have 30 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you. So I have organized the commission to play my slideshow here. Yes, thank you very much for letting me, in the name of 16 other researchers throughout Europe come with our suggestions to how to deal with this new approach or this old approach about close to nature forest management. And I think the new approach is that it is the little r, closer to nature forest management, which has been developed through the biodiversity strategy and then also in the forest strategy. And I believe that this could be a very important part of the whole development of the forest in Europe. So you know me as former being a part of this process as a facilitator, but I increasingly, as a researcher, I got a little bit uneasy about this job, and together with the commission, I decided to step out and try to work more as a researcher and trying to develop what we can call policy support to this process, knowing that policy support means that it's something which the group here can use, but it is mainly for inspiration. So we will try now here to give some options for principles and give some ideas how to develop a framework which could be used European-wide. Please, next. And just to show you, and I think this is very important, the situation, the forest situation, ecologically, economically, social, culturally, are extremely different throughout Europe. So if we really want to develop some kind of basic principles or frameworks for dealing with this, we have really to include all regions in Europe. So by in this work which we have been doing here, we have tried to find people throughout whole Europe. And you can see from Portugal and Italy through Central and Eastern Europe and up to the boreal forest in Finland and in Sweden. And then you can see there's a little tree in Scotland, but we are taking maybe not it for granted, but we hope maybe one day Scotland could return to the EU. You never know. Next slide, please. So what we are doing now is to develop a report, and this report has not been completely finished, but we aim, it is now under review. And in this report, we will, from a scientific point of view, we will analyze the current pressures on biodiversity, health, and resilience in the managed forest. We will examine the range of existing nature-oriented management approaches throughout whole Europe and how they support biodiversity, health, stability, and adaptability. Then we will propose some kind of a definition and a set of principles for a flexible European-wide implementation. And finally, we will discuss the barriers and the enablers for implementing such an approach. But today, and next please. But today we will present for the working group for your further deliberations some science-based options for principles, for strategies, and a framework. But just to give you the full picture, this report, which is now under review, is about 30 pages, almost 300 citations, and it will be published in late March, maybe early April, in EFI series From Science to Policy. And it is planned to make a Think Forest event on Closer to Nature Forestry in April. And basically, I just got the message from EFI that this event will take place on April the 6th from 10 to 11:30. So please, here by this event, you'll get a much more in-depth discussion about our findings. Next, please. So the the whole background for this approach is the whole idea of segregating or integrating different values in forest management. And starting with what we can call these triad mosaic-like idea, where we basically could say we will delineate some forest only for nature and the rest only for production. Then the third way to do that is to try to integrate other aspects, including nature and biodiversity, into forest management. And this is basically what close to nature or closer to nature forestry is all about. So the idea is to try to move a larger part of your forest in order to integrate these kind of functions. At the same time, also create forests which are stable and resilient to future changes in climate, for instance. Next slide, please. So our first work has been to look into what kind of nature-based management systems are already existing in Europe. And here you can see that if you are in the north, in the boreal zone, then it's mainly an issue about retention forestry to manage your forest in a traditional way, but retain structures in the forest which are important, for instance, for biodiversity. If we go down to Central Europe and Western Europe, then it's an issue about continuous forest cover forestry or closer to nature forestry. And in the Alp region, where the issue of protection is very high, you can call the management there some kind of low impact logging, selection systems, for instance, and so on. So depending upon the regions, we have different approaches already in place to deal with how to integrate nature more in forest management. And then in red, we have here tried to highlight two other issues. And one is the issue of emulating natural disturbance forestry, which is now approaching in the northern part of Europe. And we believe that this emulating natural disturbance regimes in our management could be some kind of an overarching concept which could be used throughout the whole Europe. I'll come back to that. Another thing is when we are dealing with biodiversity in forestry, we have to acknowledge that a number of historical management practices for which has been taking place in Europe over the last 2,000-3,000 years, they have also created or developed a specific nature, a specific biodiversity, which we, I think, as foresters also have to take care of. So we have, although you can say it is strange to take historical management into consideration when we are talking about closer to nature, because that will be more closer to culture, you could say. But we think it is important to also highlight this area of forestry. Next slide, please. And here you can see how this is in the boreal north. One of our co-authors here from Finland has developed this scheme of how to deal with closer to a natural disturbance regime in the boreal forest. And here you can see, depending upon what kind of scale this disturbance operates in, it could be a fire, it could be storm, it could be bark beetles attack, and so on. Then you can work in a disturbance-based management regime with everything from you can call it modified clear cutting. That means clear cutting with retention over partial harvesting, variable retention into almost single tree and group selection, depending upon what kind of disturbance regime basically are operating here. And I think this is a very important information here to see that you cannot take the Central European very small-scaled, disturbance-oriented management system and put it into everywhere in northern Europe, because this will not be, at least not everywhere, natural. Next slide, please. And then here I have a couple of slides which are highlighting the importance, not least the importance for biodiversity and also for cultural heritage in these old management systems. Here you see a grazing forest, or the so-called dehesa in Spain, or montado, I think it's called in Portugal. These are very biodiversity-rich landscapes with trees, which at least also have to be taken into consideration when we are dealing with nature and forestry. Next, please. And then here you can see another important issue. Going 300-400 years back, a huge area of the forest in Europe were managed by coppicing systems, or here copies with standards, which also create a very unique biological environment. And this has to more or less been also looked upon in relation to biodiversity and forest management in the future. Next, please. So what kind of pressures do we have on forest biodiversity? I'll make it very short here. First of all, I think the most important pressure we are facing in the future, it is the climate change, and partly also eutrophication. But then working with internal pressures, then of course our way to harvest old growth forest, remove old and dead and dying trees are very detrimental for biodiversity. The clear cutting with extraction of all areas are in many places at least very problematic. Forest type and habitat conversion, introduction of invasive non-native or poorly adapted native species are a problem. High population of large herbivores can be a problem for regeneration, especially for native tree and bush species. And then the last thing, the abandonment of traditional forest management approaches, coppicing, wood pasture systems, and so on. Next slide. So what now we have tried to highlight here some of the principles which we think should be taken into consideration. First of all, of course, the retention of habitat trees and deadwood, the promotion of native tree species, but then we say also as well as site-adapted non-native species. And this is very important, and this is also a little bit controversial, but when we are going to accept that our ecosystems are under change, the climate are changing, then and we are also in many cases running out of our native species. In Central Europe, beech are under pressure in many places. The ash is more or less disappeared in Central and Northern Europe due to the ash dieback and so on. And we have to be open in order to develop or maintain functional forest in the future. We have to be open also to use tree species which are not native, but which of course should not be invasive in any kind. So it is important to look into this as some kind of a balance between protecting what is there, but also allowing new species or new genes to move in. And there is the whole issue about assisted migration, which might be a little bit controversial, but we have to acknowledge that. Then, of course, the promotion of natural tree generation is important. And then the issue of partial harvest and promotion of structural variation. This is extremely important, but again, and now we have here put emulating natural disturbances into a parenthesis, just to highlight that depending on if we really want to work with nature, we also have to understand on what scale are nature developing And the whole basic for natural regeneration is the dying of old trees to give space for new trees. And that happens in many different ways throughout Europe. As I said before, in Northern Europe, at least on drier sites, this happens on a larger scale than if you are in Central Europe or partly in Southern Europe. So this partial harvest, the scale, time discussion about what to harvest and how much is extremely important. Then promoting tree species variation and genetic variation. That's very important, not least in order to maintain or develop stability and resilience in our forest. Then the issue of avoidance of intensive management operation, that's extremely important, but again, intensive management operations are differently depending on where we are in Europe. And then last, supporting landscape heterogeneity and functional habitat networks. Now we are moving out of the stand level, but into the larger landscape level. So these are in our view, most important principles we at least would present here for you to continue discussing and work on. Next slide, please. Then we have tried here very short to propose some principles, some strategies according to the principles which we just defined before. So you could say that one strategy is to aim at promoting components, structures, and processes characteristic of natural forest and cultural woodlands of the specific region. Again, it has to be looked into on a regional level. These forests will feature a diversity of tree species and structures, a variety of tree sites and development stages, and a range of habitat, including habitat trees and deadwood. And then the third one here, we have also several others, but these are some of the most important, we think, is timber harvesting will pay as much attention to what is retained in the forest as what is removed. This is a very central issue. Next slide, please. So this is not the last, sorry, yes. Now we come to also, again, very short, some kind of framework for the implementation. First of all, the management approach will reflect regional, ecological, economic, social, and cultural variation across the countries. That's extremely important. Managers will embrace diversity, learn from natural processes that influence their forest, and anticipate the impact of climate change. We cannot continue dealing with the forest just looking behind, because climate is changing. A lot of other things are also under the move. So we have to look forward and we have to anticipate these changing environments in our management. Planning is essential and will be built on a long-term vision. And that means that we need patience. And the next thing is management approach will be developed in consultation with stakeholders. And that's basically also what the Commission are doing just now. We are sitting here and we have representatives from all European or EU countries. And it is basically to create ownership and to embrace all variation within Europe in relation to forest and forest management. And what also is important is that we are going to learn along the way. That means we are going to look into management in terms of adaptive management and in terms of adaptive learning. So these issues will be key. We don't know what kind of climate we really are going to have in this century, and how that will vary within Europe. So we have to model through, you can say that. So, and then the next slide. Here are some, but again, I must reiterate that in this short time, it's only possible for us to take out some key issues. The whole issue about stability, health, and so on. We have not time to go into details. But what we can say as a take-home message already now is that these closer to nature forest management has a great potential to integrate different management objectives, including biodiversity, thereby also facilitating forest health as well as adaptation and climate change. Because one of the most important issues about forest health and about adaptation, about resilience, it is basically variation. Variation on the gene level, variation on the species level, variation on the landscape level. These kind of variations are extremely important for maintaining and developing resilience, and this is basically also the basis for maintaining and promoting biological variation and biodiversity. So this is a very important take-home message. The other thing is it's essential to respect regional variation in ecological, economic, and social cultural settings. It's a journey which will take time and require long-term commitment. And there's a need for consistent long-term financial support for private forest owners who embark on this journey. Otherwise, we believe it will not work. In the long run, this kind of close to nature approach will probably be as profitable as the classical one, not least because these forests are going to be more stable and resilient. But in the process of transforming our classical forest system into the closer to nature, then it needs, for at least for private forest owner, it needs some kind of support, or you could also say not support, but payment for ecosystem services, because biodiversity is an ecosystem service. So I would probably better like to say we need, at least for private forest owners, that they should be paid for the ecosystem services they are providing. And then it's important to develop a support network of demonstration plots and so on to aid the transformation. And that is also what we have in our report. We have in an annex, we have a whole list of different kind of networks and demonstration systems and plots which can be used already now for these transformation process on the regional or partly the local level. And then the last slide, and then I think it's the last one. Yes, it's the last one. So this is a thank you message. Thank you to the Commission. Also, thank you for EFI who have basically supported this process. But it's also a reminder to all of us that when we are dealing with closer to nature forest management, then we are basically focusing upon forests which are delivering also their traditional service. That means wood for the industry, but also not least wood for the growing and very important bioeconomical development, which we have to do in the transition process to getting carbon neutral. And then with this picture here, you can see that selective thinning are also possible This here is in the north, in Scandinavia. Selective thinning are also possible with modern harvester. You don't need to have big clear cuts when you are working with big machines. So with this, I think very promising and hopeful, enjoying picture here. I would, in the name of all my 16 co-authors here, thank you very much for the attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Bo, for this presentation and also keeping the time. Very much appreciated. And I think I can speak on behalf of, I guess, everyone in this meeting that we are very much looking forward to your report coming out in April, I understand. So I'm sure this will be a very useful contribution to this process. Before I pass the floor on to the next speaker, I would like to see if there are technical clarifications for understanding from the audience. We can give this 1 or 2 minutes while reminding colleagues in this meeting that there will be a discussion on the content presented at the end of the 4 presentations in the first session. But should you have some clarification questions on some of the terminology introduced, for example, then please don't hesitate to introduce it in the chat. Haha, what is considered intensive? I guess that's maybe more for the discussion, but I will pass the floor to Bo if he wants to react on this now. Thank you.
Yes, I could say that what is considered as intensive, you could say it is something which is very far away from nature, far away from what nature in this specific context would have done. That means if you are in Central Europe, where the disturbance regime is small scale and so on, then big clear cut will be intensive management when it's replaced with a monoculture of something. Yeah. But if you are in the far north of Finland or Sweden, then some kind of clear cut will not be considered intensive because it is within the dynamics of the forest when it's left to its own. So you can, if that could at least explain a bit what we mean about intensive. But it's to go away from this issue of saying clear cut is not, it doesn't work for close to nature management. Yes, in many parts of Europe, probably not, but because this will be intensive. But in other parts, some kind of modified clear cutting will not be addressed as intensive. So if you measure your intervention in relation to what is it within the limit of natural processes, is it supporting natural processes, then it will not be considered as intensive. That could be an explanation. But I have a number of very good co-authors, and I will really urge them to come with their opinion. And now I will shut up because my co-authors are much more knowledgeable about these things as I am. Thanks. Please.
Thank you very much, Bo. Yes, would someone from the co-authors like to come in briefly before we continue? Because as I said, I think this is really something also for the discussion that we will have at the end. But nevertheless, I would invite co-authors to come in now if they wish to do so. Thank you. Okay, I guess then we keep this for further discussion at the end of the first session. Maybe also Merit, thank you very much for your comment. That's duly noted. And again, I think it links neatly to what I just said in terms of that this we will continue this conversation after the presentations. With that, I now give the floor to Lauri, who is a leading expert for Tapio Oy in Finland, which is an independent consultancy and advisory provider for forest management in Finland. Lauri, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie, and hello everyone. I'm Lauri Saaristo. My background is I'm a forest biologist, and I've been specialized with the forest biodiversity issues. I've worked with the Finnish forestry sector now about 20 years, developing forest management practices and forest management recommendations. I'm also the chair of the forest group of the Finnish Board on Ecological Restoration. And I'll give you a short summary of retention forestry in Finland. Retention in managed forest means living trees and forest patches that are permanently left untouched. There you see the pictures of retention trees and tree groups, valuable habitats, buffer zones along waters and open mires. And if you calculate these all together, you get the total amount of retention in our managed forest areas. And this is based on legislation and forest certification and forest management recommendations that are coordinated by my organization, Tapio. Well, if we think about getting closer to natural biodiversity in Finnish managed forest, we have to think, what do we have? We have 1,000 years of history of forest use for multiple purposes. Forest structures that differ greatly from natural boreal forests. Natural old-growth forest landscapes in Finland are present only in the northern part of the country. Still, in the Red List book, 4/5 of natural forest animal, plant, and fungi species have maintained viable populations, as you can see the part of least concerns estimated species in the picture. So one could ask that how is it even possible that there is this much least concern species when you look at the situation? And I give you some explanations. Firstly, our managed forests are covered by natural tree species. Many of the forest species in the boreal region can tolerate human-caused disturbances if their key resources present. Like here you can see a storm damage where there is a lot of deadwood after the damage, which is important to many of about 5,000 species living in forests. And it's very open habitat, but the key is the resource, the deadwood for the species. There are some pictures of the storms and the tree cover loss, 2010 storms in Finland. Then a large proportion of forest species are dependent on broadleaf trees that are naturally regenerating efficiently to disturbed open patches. Here you can see the numbers of generalist and specialist herbivore species living in coniferous and broadleaf trees. And there is a very large proportion of species here. This is a picture from a very new book, The Tree Dwellers, that was published last year. And finally, the retention forestry practices in Finland adopted since 1990s. There is a picture of the cover of the book, Forest Management Recommendations for Close to Nature Forestry, 1994, published by Tapio. And we know that this change that happened during 90s in forestry have already had positive impact to many species that were previously in the red list. So, but we are not still there. This is 1/5 of species in the red list. It's of course a serious problem, and we need to do many things to halt the loss of biodiversity in our forests. And here are the main things that we need to get to manage forest areas to get them closer to natural biodiversity. We have to have as many species inhabiting managed forests than it can be possible. So, and we need to stop the near threatened species to go threatened. And so there is many things we need to do. More deadwood and old overaged trees we need to have in the forests. We should do better maintenance of the valuable habitats. It should be greater mixture of broadleaf trees in the forest. There should be more biodiversity-oriented management in herb-rich forest and sun-exposed esker habitats. This is very important because over half of the threatened species in Finland are connected to these sites, which are about only 1 to 2% of the total forest area in Finland. So with a very little area, small area, we can do a lot of to make things better for red-listed species. We need to do more prescribed burnings annually. As you probably know, we are very efficient in Finland in killing down our forest fires, and we need controlled fires here to secure biodiversity. There should be better maintenance of understory vegetation, bush layer, and small trees. Also, we need larger proportion of forest with continuous tree cover. So at the moment, the proportion of forest in continuous tree cover is too low. Then we should have larger proportion of forest in the older, about over 100 years age classes, which is of course a question of a longer rotation period, but it's of course a question of getting more protected areas to the landscape. My conclusion here is that the aim of defining closer to nature forest management is to enhance biodiversity in managed forests. If this is the aim, then developing variable retention forestry plays here in Finland the key role. It's good. It can and should be applied both in even age and continuous cover forestry. Here are some pictures that we have open access GIS data for forest management to improve variable retention tree planning. We have modeled moisture index, and we have also tools for evaluating best places for the retention within a forest, and we have mapped our valuable habitats, many of them. So there is a lot of information that can be used for variable retention. And here's a picture of forest regenerated with 50% variable retention. Well, this is much more than is done in normal forestry in Finland, but that's a good example of the direction we should move. We made a summary with the forest group of Finnish Board on Ecological Restoration. We made a summary with the group about concerning this retention forestry, and these were our messages for the decision makers in Finland for developing retention forestry in Finland. First of all, variable retention forestry is an essential tool for halting the biodiversity loss in managed forests in Finland. Second, the level of variability of retention should be increased to achieve all the necessary benefits for biodiversity. This means will apply every should be raised, and there should be more forest needed where the retention level is significantly higher than the average at the moment. The forest owners and managers need site-specific information that supports the identification of the targets of the retention, just like Bo said, that there should be more thoughts what is left into the forest, and it should be based on certain targets. And the further development of economical compensation mechanism for retention forestries. This doesn't mean only the forest owners. This means also that the forest managers, the people doing the operation and doing the planning, their time means money, and whenever the planning processes become more complex, then it needs more time, and someone has to pay it. So I think that was my short presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laurie. This was very useful indeed to get a bit of nice picture to hear a bit more about the approaches and considerations in Finland. I would like to pass you one question that received in the chat before we move to the next speaker, being wary of the timing. And this is from Soltan. What is the tendency in relation to the status of forest dwelling species in Finland? Is there any sign of worsening the situation? Could you maybe briefly react to that question before we pass to the next speaker? Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't got the question. Could it be possible to have it in the chat so I could answer it later? And we have also here Professor Matti Koivula from our expert group, and he can also answer to your questions.
Yes, sorry, indeed. I now see that Matti already replied, so I hope that question has been addressed. Okay, then, yeah, okay. And then, yeah, okay, this is now getting more into details, so I think this will need be taken up maybe later on in the discussion. Okay, then thank you very much, Laurie. And then I would like to introduce our next speaker, which is Bogdan, or the second Pope of today's meeting, and he will tell us a bit about the question if clear cutting is compatible with closer to nature forestry from a Polish point of view. Bogdan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bogdan Brzeziecki. I am working at the Department of Silviculture since about 40 years already at Warsaw University of Life Sciences. In my presentation, I would like to speak about clear cutting as a specific kind of silvicultural system. That's why I would like to begin with the definition of silvicultural system. Next slide, please. According to prevailing definition, commonly accepted definition, silvicultural system is a procedure by which a tree stand is established or renewed by means of artificial or natural reproduction. Two main goals of every silvicultural system is the removal of the old stand and creating most favorable conditions for establishment of a new forest stand. From the purely silvicultural point of view, the second goal is more important. Usually our expectations, our requirements in respect to these new forest stands are very high. That's why the choice of a proper system is so important. Next slide, please. Polish foresters can select between several different systems and regeneration methods. According to our silvicultural guidelines, we distinguish 5 major groups of systems as shown on this slide. Each group is represented by a number of forms. They differ mainly in terms of size and shape of regeneration unit. Every form of silvicultural system can and should be further modified and adapted to local stand and site conditions. Next slide, please. One of most important factors which influence the choice of a given silvicultural system are ecological requirements. First of all, light requirements of tree species. Under conditions of Polish lowlands, which occupy almost 90% of the whole country's territory, shade-intolerant tree species clearly prevail. So it resembles maybe the situation in Finland. For example, the share of light-demanding Scots pine in our forest is 56%, while the share of shade-tolerant silver fir is 4% only. Next slide, please. For light-demanding, fast-growing tree species like pine, birch, aspen, alder, oak, the clear-cutting system is by far the best choice. In its classical form, standard form, it's relatively simple and efficient system which favors creation of single species, even-aged forest stands. Next slide, please. Since long, it's widely known that clear-cutting system has both several disadvantages as well as many advantages. Examples are provided in this table. They have often been described in the literature. An important advantage of the clear-cutting system is, among other things, that it affords complete overhead light, which is an important consideration for light-demanding tree species. To make the optimal use of the merits and advantages of clear-cutting system and at the same time to reduce its potentially negative impacts, foresters in Poland often modify as much as possible the classical scheme of clear-cutting system. Next slide, please. These modifications include, among other things, wide application of so-called combined systems. They consist of combination of several smaller clear cuttings separated by some time interval, as shown in top, or combination of clear cuttings and shelterwood cuttings, shown in bottom. The overall goal of such combined systems is the conversion of pure stands into mixed stands. Next slide. Next slide, please. Clear-cut areas are also a very efficient method to obtain natural seeding from the adjacent mature stand located windward. This photo shows an example. The Scots pine seedlings, which you can see here, were not planted, but they originated from pine seeds distributed by wind. The photo shows also the importance of exposing the mineral soil by appropriate soil treatment. Next slide. This is another example of naturally regenerated Scots pine stand already at the thicket stage. Next slide, please. In this case, a small clear cut was established and artificially regenerated by planting oak seedlings. Scots pine regenerated naturally, and it makes possible to obtain in future a mixed stand consisting of both oak and pine. By the way, the area had to be fenced to protect young trees against browsing by game. Next slide, please. A frequent modification of a classical clear-cutting system is leaving different structural elements of the existing stand for the next forest growth cycle, thanks to retention forestry, which was described by a colleague from Finland. These elements include pre-existing groups and patches of poles and saplings, so-called old growth islands, cavity trees, rare tree species, trees of unusual forms, so-called standards, second canopy layer, etc. General goal of such activities is to increase the structural diversity of future forest generation, which is important prerequisite for their high natural values, enhanced resilience and adaptation potential. Next slide, please. Recently, more and more authors underline the positive impact of even-aged forest systems and clear cuttings and overall forest biodiversity. One example is shown on this slide. The authors of this publication say that for managed temperate forest, conservationists and policymakers favor fine-grained, uneven-aged management over more traditional coarse-grained, even-aged management. However, our results, their results, show that mosaic of different age classes produced by even-aged systems is more important for regional diversity than high within stand heterogeneity, which is produced by uneven-aged management. Next slide, please. This is another example, a paper written by a group of Czech scientists, which say that opening up the canopy of a closed forest is beneficial for woodland biodiversity. They say also that the creation of clearings in closed canopy forests had a positive effect on overall species richness. Next slide, please. All these findings correlate very well with the results of our study on the long-term dynamics of strictly protected forest stands in the Białowieża National Park in northeastern part of Poland. We see very clearly that a lack of major so-called stand-initiating disturbances, either natural or human-related, leads to a strong compositional impoverishment and structural homogenization of natural strictly protected forest stands with several negative consequences for local biodiversity. Next slide. So time for some major conclusions. There is no doubt that the choice of silvicultural system is one of the most important decisions in forestry. Diversity of stand and environmental conditions calls for application of many silvicultural systems and regeneration methods. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. Light requirements of tree species belong to key factors influencing the choice of silvicultural system. In case of shade-intolerant tree species, clear cutting system with modifications, many examples were provided already today, is usually the most appropriate option. Next slide, and second last. Beside apparent disadvantages, clear cutting system has several clear advantages. This can be considered from many different viewpoints. They have been often described in the literature. Recent studies demonstrate a positive impact of even-aged management and clear cuts on overall regional biodiversity of forest ecosystem. In managed forests, clear cutting system replaces natural so-called stand-initiating disturbances and initiates developmental processes which involve the whole range of tree life histories and related forest biota. Next slide, and the last one. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bogdan. I think this has been, again, very interesting, and to see how diverse the different experiences can be in different regions. Maybe before moving on to the next speaker, just to again give the possibility, should anyone have a technical clarification question, then please put it in the chat now. And then considering the time, maybe Bogdan, you could respond directly in the chat if someone has a technical question, and then I would directly pass on to our last speaker of the first session, Yuri, who will, from the University in Ljubljana, who will now give us or tell us a bit about the experience with close to nature forestry in Slovenia. Yuri, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Do you see my slide? So it's okay. I can start the talk. Okay, dear ladies and gentlemen, the purpose of my contribution is twofold. First, I would like to point out the frequent misunderstandings about close to nature forestry among both the lay and professional public. And second, I would like to point out achievements and also hindrances in the implementation of this approach in Slovenia, which can be useful for other countries. The first misconception is that close to nature forestry is a relatively new management approach. CTNF has recently become increasingly interesting, but its beginnings go back several centuries to the Renaissance. At that time, for example, in Slovenia, farmer selection forests were important with rafting of large diameter timber for ship building. Later, at the end of 19th century, regulated selection management was introduced on 40,000 hectares with forest management plans for large estates. At the same time, von Schollmeyer introduced the autochthonous control method as a precursor of adaptive management. Does CTNF equals selection system? Not really. In Slovenia, irregular shelterwood is far predominant, and the share of the selection system is less than 10%. The same is true, for example, in Switzerland. In practice, however, we adapt very much to the details of the site and stand, which actually means a special system for each individual case. So we speak of a so-called freestyle silviculture. This approach was already mentioned by Professor Engler from Switzerland in the late 19th century. Is CTNF suitable only for shade-tolerant species and rich forest sites? For example, Slovenia has a variety of forest sites ranging from sub-Mediterranean forests with oaks and pines to virtually boreal forest near the upper timberline. And in all of them, we apply CTNF based on natural regeneration under more or less canopy cover, adapted to the ecology of tree species. Besides silvics and scene ecology, phytosociology, historical disturbance regimes are also important for CTNF. In Slovenia, the first research on this topic was conducted in the last third of the 20th century. Is CTNF all about economics? Not true. In Slovenia, almost half of the forests are part of the Natura 2000 network with some restrictions on management. On the estate we manage, we do not harvest in the spring because the Tetrao urugalus is mating. For endangered species, we maintain open areas in the forests, although from a pure economic perspective, planting trees would be more profitable. We pay attention to seniors, microhabitats, snakes, and coarse woody debris. In addition to biodiversity, we consider many other forest functions through our management, especially direct protection functions. A few accomplishments. Well-developed approaches to gradual conversion. Over the past 70 years, many spruce plantations and also forests with non-native species have been converted to uneven-aged mixed stands. Further, Natura 2000 sites within forests are managed through a forest management planning system that has been restructured and requires consistent participation of nature conservation. This approach is challenging and not always the most pleasant. The results are a solid compromise between biodiversity conservation, economic viability, and other forest functions. Further approaches have been developed for mechanized harvesting in combination with moto manual logging that allow for low damage to regeneration and remaining stand when harvesting large diameter hardwoods. And with this, we also reduced forest roads density, and with this, erosion and soil compaction. And auction of the most valuable timber that has been held for 16 years now is contributing to better knowledge of tree species among forest owners, to more targeted individual tree tending and promotion of quality. This year, the highest price for a sycamore maple log was 48,000 euros, one log. Obstacles. Declining management after 1991 due to restructuring of forestry, decline of wood processing industry, and intensification of nature conservation. This has led to delays in conversion and greater vulnerability of forests to disturbance. Further, steady decline of selection system over the last half century. This was partly justified, but the principle of selection is very important under conditions of climate change because it allows the preservation of ecosystem climate. A century of overbrowsing makes natural regeneration of some species very difficult. Species that are important for forest adaptation to climate change, such as silver fir, noble hardwoods, oaks, and pioneers, are particularly at risk. And subsidy system is very complex and requires close scrutiny of measures at individual developmental stages, and that are very difficult to identify in this type of measurement. Let me summarize. Close to nature forestry builds on tradition, but experience with gradual conversion of plantation shows that substantial changes in stand mixture and structure are possible within few decades. Gradual conversion could be profitable from the start, but it cannot compete with a fast growing plantation. Here we have to be clear. Close to nature forestry is much more than selection system. It involves variable management tools adapted to each site and site combination. It is so-called freestyle silviculture. Close to nature forestry requires ongoing dialogue with the forest owner, nature conservation, and all other stakeholders. It is a process. The implementation of CTNF is much easier if the public forest service, management planning, and especially tree marking are organized. The later costs, for example, the Slovenian state, only about 2 euros per cubic meter of wood. However, nothing is more important than practical examples. Therefore, I invite you to visit Slovenia and see for yourself the successes and also the problems of CTNF in discussion with our foresters and forest owners. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yuri, for this final presentation in the first session, sharing a bit more on the experience in Slovenia, which again I think is very interesting and useful for the development of the guidelines that we've endeavored on, and also for the discussions that we will have now. I've seen that there have been already quite some discussions going on in the chat regarding especially the presentation by Laurie. But I would like to start coming back with some of the first comments that we had after both presentations when I said that we will take them up in the discussions to start with. And that links to some comments regarding definitions, which also I've seen coming through in some of the presentations, some of the other comments, that this is really key. Also considering that there seem to be different use of the same terminology in different countries. And I think the example given here from Peter in Slovakia was regarding intensive and extensive management. So one thing is to really make sure that there is a common understanding of the terminology, and then also maybe to set certain parameters to say, okay, this could qualify as closer to nature, and this might be seen more as a traditional forestry practice. Having said that, I would like now to let you know that if you would like to take the floor, please raise your hand and we will unmute you. And please just start to speak once you see that your microphone has been unmuted. And with that, I would like to ask Daniela, who's hosting this meeting for us today, to unmute first Jürgen Bauhaus, who is a co-author of Bo's report, who tried to respond earlier after Bo's invitation and did not get the opportunity. So Jürgen, I would like to invite you to come in on the questions on the definitions, I guess, once Daniela has given you the possibility to unmuted your speaker. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope I'm unmuted. And greetings from the sunny southwest corner of Germany, Freiburg. I think it is important to be aware that intensive and extensive are just parts of a gradient. Yeah? So this is not a black and white thing. And we have not done well in the past in terms of defining what forest management intensity may actually mean. And I think that the input, whether something is clear-cut or not, is not a good measure. We need to look at how certain processes or functions are impacted, to what extent biodiversity may be impacted, or what proportion of soil may be compacted. This is a more useful measure of intensity. There have been some scientific approaches to try and quantify forest management intensity. For example, through impacts on biodiversity or the proportion of biomass that is removed over harvesting operations, the proportion of soil influenced, or the proportion of area that is to which agrochemicals are applied, such as fertilizer or pesticides, etc. So I think we can do better there. I just wanted to make that point that intensity is a gradient, not a particular type of forest management.
Okay, thank you very much, Jürgen. I think this was very useful. And then I see that Bogdan has raised his hand. So maybe if you would like to react on this directly, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A very short comment on this discussion about intensive and extensive. I think in Poland we would relate this issue to the ratio between timber harvesting and volume increment. That it would be a kind of measure for intensity of forest management. So the lower this ratio, the less intensity, the less intense forest management. But it is, of course, one possibility to define the intensity of forest management. I am aware. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this additional information regarding the approach in Poland. Do we have further speakers from the audience that would like to come in either on this discussion vis-a-vis definitions and understanding of different terminologies, or also other issues, of course, like, for example, there was another comment in the chat early vis-a-vis the concerns about economic losses when moving towards continuous cover forestry, which I think could also be an interesting link to your Bo. Before I give you the floor, I would like to invite participants to come in. Daniela, do we have further ones?
Yes, we have Copa Cojega who first raised the hand, then CEPF and Eustafo.
Okay, then I would like to give those three the floor, one after the other, and then it's for Bo to come in. Thank you.
Thank you and good morning, everybody. First of all, thank you for very interesting presentations. My name is Anna-Rosa Asikainen, and on behalf of Copa Cojega, I would like to ask two questions if possible. So first, as we all know, sustainable forest management is all about balancing different objectives and taking into account environmental, social, and economic pillar of sustainability at the same time. Could the experts please talk more about and how this holistic approach is addressed within the context of closer to nature forestry? So basically, how would you describe the relationship between closer to nature forestry and sustainable forest management? And then the second questions, in the voluntary guidelines that are currently in preparation within the Commission, there has been a section with the title taking closer to nature forestry to larger scale. I would like to hear from the experts that what do you see as possible obstacles and opportunities for this development to taking closer to nature forestry to larger scale? Thank you very much.
Okay, could I invite, before giving the floor to the speakers, could I please invite the other two who raised their hands to come in with their questions, and then I will pass the floor to the speakers. Thank you.
Sorry, there is a third person, a fourth now from Luke, who would like to take the floor as well.
Okay, let's go first those three, and then we give the floor to the speakers, and then we take a next round. Thank you.
So I see I'm unmuted, so I assume it's my turn. So it's Helen from CEPF. I had two reflection on which I'd be happy to hear the speaker's view. There was this concept of a long-term vision being needed for this. And I would like to hear a bit more into what would have been the enabling condition in it. Among other, I would be interested to hear about stability of the policy framework, because obviously we all know that forests are very slow to respond, and we are in a very changing moment in terms of policy frameworks. That's a first point. And then it's a general reflection on which I think that it, following the discussion we had in the working group earlier, well, I was about to say earlier this month, but last month, on how broad the approach to closer to nature can be in terms of achieving its result. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniela. Please give the floor to the third one. Then we take those questions, and then I will give the floor to the speakers. Thank you. Do we have a third question from the participant?
Yes, thank you very much. This is Piotr Borkowski from the European State Forest Association. First of all, I wanted to thank very much both the Commission and then all the speakers for really organizing this very much expert discussion and for delivering very good examples on actually what are the options for managing forests closer to the natural processes which are ongoing in the ecosystems. My question would be, first, we received a couple of examples from different spots. When will be the time and actually to make it in the wider context of the European Union or even of the European continent, because The fact that we have, for example, successful stories with closer to nature forest management in Slovenia, also from the point of view of economy of this management, it may be worth of considering how to make kind of extrapolation of this successful management on the wider scale, and then actually what will be needed to ensure that this kind of management can be practiced on the wider scale. Professor Larsson mentioned, for example, in his presentation that there is definitely a need for a kind of incentivizing or support mechanisms, especially for small-scale forest owners, which is indeed the truth. But on the other hand, the costs are not only borne by the small-scale forest owners. The large-scale forest management, which we do represent as Eustafor, are also involved in management. In most of the cases, the management is being financed from the income from forestry. So my question would be how to make sure that the whole system of forest management, whatever we call it, close to nature, sustainable, multifunctional, is still working as the entire system and allows for the necessary investments into the asset, into the resource. Because without prospering forest economy, I believe not much can be done by those who are expected to manage forests according to these good examples of how the management should be. And the last actually comment I wanted to make, I wanted to announce that from the side of European forest owners and forest managers, we also would like to contribute to this debate, and then both Confederation of Private Forest Owners and Eustafor is organizing on the 10th of March a webinar under the subject How Close to Nature is the Management of European Forests, which we hope to deliver also quite important expertise on this. And then in the chat, I will put the link to the event. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thanks to all the pertinent questions that we received, and also quickly to Piotr for announcing a next meeting on Close to Nature. I think this will be very much appreciated as well, considering that there is quite a lot of interest in discussing, and probably also need to do so. So yes, please put the details of this upcoming event on the 10th of March in the chat, so that everyone interested can take good note of it. And then I would like to pass the floor to our speakers to react to one or several, all of those questions in relation to the balance of the different pillars of sustainability or profitability, critical enablers for close to nature, how to upscale, and what are, for example, timelines for success. So who would like to react first? Maybe I invite Bo, considering that you had your hand raised before.
I would like to ask my co-authors first, and then maybe if I get 1 minute at the end. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Dear co-authors, could you please raise your hand now if you would like to come in, and other participants kindly take your hand down so that Daniela can differentiate between you. And then Daniela, please pass the floor to the co-authors that raised their hands. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see, well, Bogdan, he can unmute himself.
Yes, but I would first like to give the co-authors
Jürgen.
of both report who are in the participants.
Jürgen has just raised his hand.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
Okay, if no other one wants to chip in, I'll pop in here. Jürgen Bauhus again, Uni Freiburg. There was the question about sort of scaling close to forest management up to broader areas in Europe. And I think that the point that has been made needs to be stressed again this will be quite costly because the transformation of forest needs to go hand in hand with adaptation of the forests. And this requires quite significant investments of forest owners to carry out this adaptation and transformation. And they need to do this at a time of great uncertainty regarding the future impacts of climate change and the other factors that Bo has already outlined. And as has been put as well, forest owners do this to a great extent for common goods, in particular those goods that both the EU as well as member states have been signatories of international treaties regarding biodiversity, climate change, and so on. And to support them to achieve these goals that are important for society, I think it is important that they need to be supported financially through the reward for the provision of these ecosystem services, but also technically. A lot of private forest owners own only a very small piece of land, and the experiential knowledge that they have is eroding rapidly in these times of climate change. So they also need support in drawing up management plans, adaptation plans, and need to receive technical support to actually carry out the management. I rest it there.
We also have Renzo
Jürgen.
Motta.
First, do we have further co-authors from the participants who would like to come in?
Renzo Motta, I don't know if he's an author, and Per Angelstam.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you to Bo for this very nice presentation. I would like to draw your attention to a question that has been raised by Bo, that is the extremely wide range of variability that we have in Europe. When we speak European forestry, we always think about clear-cut in Scandinavia, but it is not like that all over Europe. In Central and Southern Europe, we have a very, very different situation. For example, in Italy, clear-cut is banished. Of course, we have other silvicultural systems like copies with standard that can be compared to clear-cut with reserves. But you have to think that 100% of our forests have a landscape constraint. 90% of the forests are protected because are in the slope, in the mountains, or in the hills, and 35% of the forests are inside Natura 2000 or natural parks. As a result, most of the forests are abandoned because this constraint means cost for the owners, cost for the managers, and there is an ideological approach that abandoned means rewilding. But as Bo has stated at the beginning, rewilding is possible if we are within the historical range of variability of the forest. If our forests have been strongly, deeply transformed in the past, like chestnut forest in Italy, Norway spruce forest in Central Europe, abandonment doesn't mean rewilding. It means decline for a long term. So the close to nature management has to take into account also the management of this kind of forest that have been created by humans and have to be managed if we want to maintain the ecosystem services that have been provided by these forests in the past. And the owners and the managers need support to manage the forest and to manage this forest in a closer to nature way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before passing the floor to Bogdan, I would like to give now the floor to Per Angelstam, who is another co-author for the report presented by Bo. Per, if you would like to come in briefly, considering that we're already beyond schedule, and there's still quite some interest to come in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm speaking as a professor at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, but also as a forest owner. And I think, sort of adding to what Jürgen said, a dominating group of forest owners are the small forest owners in Europe. And I think if we look a little bit historically, the profiles of benefits, or we call them ecosystem services, that foresters and forest owners have benefited from has been very dynamic over time. We don't have to go very far back. And I think if we look in the future, this is also going to be dynamic. So I really want to stress that we need to consider a much larger diversity of value chains, which have to be evaluated not only through monetary means, but also in the villages where I live. There are two actually. Local NGOs, road societies, fishing clubs, hunting clubs provide social capital. And this is extremely important for learning what sustainable forest management is and closer to nature forest management. So I just want to stress the need to consider a much broader profile of value chains and also currencies, not only money, but also social capital and other values.
Okay, thank you very much for bringing in this as a complementation to what Jürgen said earlier. I would like now to give the floor to Bogdan, who would like to come in as well. Bogdan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like to provide some comments on question about the relationships between the concept of closer to nature forestry and the concept of sustainable forest management. I have to admit, I have to be honest that I have also big trouble with this concept, the concept of closer to nature forestry. For me, it's not quite clear how it relates to the well-established, accepted 30 years ago concept of sustainable forest management either. As we know, sustainable forest management is the management of forest, means management of forest to maintain their biodiversity, productivity, regeneration capacity, vitality, etc. by definition. So the concept of sustainable forest management covers all important aspects of forestry, including also the very important issue of biodiversity. I really don't know, I really not sure if we need new labels. Multiplicity of labels leads to overall confusion only. Maybe it's good I would like to cite Professor O'Hara, the author of this publication, who says that, according to Professor O'Hara, close to nature is flawed in both its intent to emulate nature as a means to meet shifting ecological conditions and social needs. Professor O'Hara says that natural processes and stand structures are important information about natural systems, but not necessarily for the management of these changing systems. And he says also that forestry has always attempted to manage stands to meet objectives that would not be similarly met without management. So rather than striving to be close to nature that is under constant change, silviculture should strive to be better than nature. Thank you very much. I hope it was enough.
Yes, thank you very much. I don't know if some of the other speakers would like to react on this question, how close to nature relates to sustainable forest management. I see Bo is raising his hand. Bo, would you like to react on this?
Yes, thank you. I think it's a very crucial question. And of course, we should not develop a new sustainable management paradigm or frame. So everything what should be done here, and also that is our intention in our study, in our report, is to say it is within the general accepted sustainable forest management concept developed through the Forest Europe process. But what we can see is that this concept has big problems just now. There are 6 different criteria. 2 of them are really under threat, and that is the biodiversity, which we are really striving at doing something for biodiversity, and not least, and maybe even more, the issue about forest health and stability and adaptation. And this is probably the most important part of trying to get closer to nature. It is basically that forest management has over the years taken out a lot of resilience mechanisms out of the forest in order to provide wood, high amount of wood. So what we try to do with the closer to nature approach is to try to incorporate more of these stability mechanisms. For instance, variations in structures, with species diversity, and so on. And in order to enable stability and adaptation. And that goes also for the classical forestry. We are confronting with a lot of problems where forestry is breaking down just now because of big uniform systems, which basically have no resilience at all. And I think that is important. Then the issue is that together with trying to increase more resilience into the forest, then biodiversity comes in basically also through the back door. So that is, I think, the most important part of this. We are staying within the concept of sustainable forest management, but by trying to incorporate more natural mechanisms in our forest management, then we can elevate the stability, the health, and the resilience, and also the biodiversity. Yeah, that is in order to not to take too much time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bo. I think this clarification from your perspective was very useful. We are running over time, and I hope that participants and speaker can bear with that, because I think it's very important that we have this discussion. So I would like, but I also recognize that eventually we will have to move on. Before we do so, I would like to give the floor to 2 more participants. One is first Bent Leonard, and then Kari Kohonen with their question to the speakers. And then I suggest we go afterwards into the break, because I think many of those questions that come up will also be able to be addressed after we hear more from the practical experience side in the second session. Okay, Bent, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm representing EFNA, the European Forest Nurseries, and they follow these discussions, of course, very carefully and look for where they can contribute actually to help the closer to nature journey. And we recognize that voluntarity is very important, but also that you need a kind of consultation with the different stakeholders. In our perspective, it's a portion between landowners, the tree seed traders, and the forest nurseries that can provide more plant material. And in this, we find it is important that there will be established a kind of community of interested stakeholders. And yeah, so we find this with the social competence very important. So we think it's very important that we can secure knowledge among all the stakeholders to be sure that we can have the availability of the needed forest reproductive material. And actually, to secure the best planning of this, we find it's very urgent to find a longer period for subsidies. And the last question we have is actually how you will provide the promotion of tree species variation and the genetic diversity? And do you see a need for a supply of mixed seed lots that nurseries could provide? So thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Ben. Before I give the speakers the opportunity for a final round of replies, I would like Kari to come in with his question. Thank you.
Thank you. This is Kari Korhonen from the Natural Resources Institute, Finland, and I have a very simple question to the presenters today. So the current draft of the Closer to Nature forest management guidelines that is drafted by a consultant for the Commission, it is very much fixed to the idea that Closer to Nature forest management is possible only under the continuous cover forest management scheme, no matter what is the biome or forest type. So what do you think about this fixation? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Kari, for that question. I'm not sure how much the speakers can react to this because I'm not sure they necessarily have seen the draft of the guidelines, which is still under development. But maybe, yeah, I see Bo, you're raising your hands, but otherwise I think I would suggest maybe to reply to it more from a general perspective concerning the relation with continuous cover forestry otherwise. Thank you. Yeah, so Bo, you're most welcome. Come in. We can't hear you, Bo.
Just short to the last comment. That is basically, I have seen this concept or this paper, and this is basically where our report, I think, comes in and try to move out of the discussion about Central European close to nature management and then encompass or embrace whole Europe, taking in Northern Europe, the boreal zones, the Mediterranean zones into an overarching concept. So I can only invite you to the Think Forest event on the 6th of April, and there we'll have possibility to further elaborate on that. And in relation to mixed seed lots in nurseries, we have a legislation in Europe who are not allowing that. I think that the forest owner, he can mix it in himself. It doesn't have to be mixed in the seed production system, but that's another issue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Bo. Would any of the other speakers like to react before we move into the break? I don't see a hand. Okay, so well, thank you very much for all our speakers in the first session. I think this was a very useful contribution to the development of the set guidelines and also to the participants regarding their comments and observations, either by speaking or through the chat, and also to assure that those that have raised their hand, I see, for example, Barbara from BirdLife, your question will be taken up in the next discussion round, if that is okay. So we will now have a short break, and I look forward to see you back in 5 minutes as foreseen. Thank you very much.
Stefanie, das ist nur ein Test. Kannst du mich hören?